The flashing lights appeared without warning, cutting to quiet perfection of a wealthy suburban street where manicured lawns and luxury homes signaled safety for some, suspicion for others. Inside a polished black sedan sat a man who had dedicated his life to the law, to justice, and to the belief that the Constitution applied equally to everyone. Within minutes, that belief would be violently tested. His hands, steady moment before, were now raised as a weapon was pointed through the open window of his own car. The accusation came quickly and confidently, delivered without evidence or hesitation. The vehicle was stolen, the officer insisted. The man behind the wheel knew it wasn't. What he didn't know was that this traffic stop would become a national symbol of racial profiling, exposing how power, prejudice, and unchecked authority collide when black excellence challenges deeply rooted bias. Backhand index pointing right before we continue. Make sure you like, share, comment, and subscribe to Black Voice Stories so stories like this continue to be heard. The man driving the car that afternoon had built his life on discipline, restraint, and respect for the rule of law. He was not only a legal scholar, but a federal judge whose career represented decades of perseverance through institutions that rarely welcomed faces like his. Raised in a working-class black household where education was treated as survival, he learned early that excellence was not optional. It was necessary. Every achievement came with the unspoken understanding that it might still not be enough. His rise through the legal system was methodical and earned. Law school honors, clerkships, years of federal service, and eventually a judicial appointment that carried immense responsibility. He presided over cases involving constitutional rights, police conduct, and civil liberties, often reminding himself that justice required both firmness and empathy. Yet no amount of training could prepare him for the reality that outside the courtroom, the authority of his title dissolved the moment he sat behind the wheel of a luxury car in the wrong neighborhood. The neighborhood itself symbolized privilege. Wide streets, stone-faced homes, an atmosphere where residents assumed protection, not suspicion. It was a place where expensive vehicles were common. Yet the presence of a black man in one seemed to trigger an entirely different set of assumptions. That afternoon, the judge was simply driving home after a long day, his mind occupied with legal briefs and upcoming rulings. He followed traffic laws meticulously, aware of how easily a minor infraction could escalate. The police officer who initiated the stop had been patrolling the area for years, known among colleagues for aggressive enforcement. He often framed his actions as vigilance, yet his stops disproportionately targeted drivers who looked out of place according to his own narrow definition. To him, a black man in a high-end car was not a sign of success. It was a red flag. The moment the officer approached the vehicle, the tone was already set. The question was not whether something was wrong, but what accusation would be used to justify the stop. The claim came quickly. The car matched the description of a stolen vehicle. No dispatch confirmation. No visible evidence. Just suspicion elevated to certainty. The judge understood immediately what was happening. Years of studying civil rights cases had taught him this pattern well. The burden of proof had shifted unfairly onto him. His calm demeanor was not accidental. It was a survival strategy learned over a lifetime. He complied, identifying himself, explaining ownership, and remaining composed even as tension thickened in the air. Yet compliance did not bring de-escalation. It brought escalation. Backup was called. Hands were ordered into the air. The situation transformed from a routine stop into a public spectacle. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as the black man in the expensive car was treated like a criminal. The officer's voice grew louder, more commanding, feeding on authority rather than evidence. What should have ended with verification stretched into humiliation. The judge was removed from the vehicle, restrained, and placed under arrest despite repeated attempts to clarify his identity and the legitimacy of his car. The officer dismissed explanations with visible skepticism, clinging to his assumption even as facts contradicted it. At that moment, the system the judge had spent his life serving turned against him. The badge outweighed the truth. The uniform eclipsed the law. And the message was unmistakable. No title, no position, no achievement could shield a black man from being presumed guilty. The arrest reverberated far beyond the suburban street where it occurred. At the police station, The atmosphere was clinical and detached, a place where dignity was stripped as efficiently as personal belongings. The judge was processed like any other suspect, fingerprinted, photographed, and confined, despite internal records already beginning to contradict the officer's claim. Verification of the vehicle's registration confirmed what had been true all along. The car was legally owned, properly registered, and not connected to any theft report. Yet the damage had already been done. The arrest was not an error. It was an expression of bias allowed to operate unchecked. The officer's report painted a narrative that leaned heavily on perceived suspicion rather than factual findings. Language was carefully chosen to justify actions after the fact, a common tactic in cases where authority is questioned. Words like evasive, uncooperative, and non-compliant appeared despite video evidence and witness accounts that suggested otherwise. When the judge was finally released, there was no apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, only the quiet implication that inconvenience was an acceptable byproduct of policing. But inconvenience was not what had occurred. What had occurred was a violation of civil rights, a public degradation, and an abuse of power that echoed countless similar incidents experienced by Black Americans without the means or platform to fight back. The story reached legal circles quickly. Colleagues were stunned, not because racial profiling was unheard of, but because it had happened so brazenly to someone who embodied the very authority officers were sworn to respect. Media outlets began to inquire, and civil rights organizations took notice. The judge faced a painful decision. He could remain silent, protecting institutional harmony, or he could confront the injustice head-on, knowing the personal and professional scrutiny that would follow. Silence, however, would mean complicity in a system that continued to harm others. He chose accountability. The lawsuit that followed was not just about personal vindication. It was about exposing a pattern of discriminatory enforcement that thrived behind the shield of qualified immunity and departmental loyalty. Legal filings detailed how racial profiling operated not as an anomaly, but as a predictable outcome of biased assumptions embedded within policing culture. The city's defense attempted to minimize the incident, framing it as a misunderstanding resolved without lasting harm. But the harm was undeniable. Emotional distress, reputational damage, and the psychological weight of knowing that authority could turn hostile without cause all carried measurable impact. As the case progressed, evidence mounted. Dashboard footage contradicted the officer's statements. Dispatch logs revealed no confirmation of a stolen vehicle prior to the arrest. Expert testimony contextualized the stop within broader patterns of racial profiling, drawing connections to studies and prior cases. Public attention intensified. Community members shared similar experiences, many far more severe and without legal recourse. The judge's case became a mirror reflecting a larger truth, that racial bias does not discriminate between the powerful and the powerless. Inside the courtroom, the imbalance of power shifted. The badge was no longer unquestioned. The officer's decisions were scrutinized, his assumptions dissected, and his credibility challenged. The same legal standards often applied harshly to defendants were now applied to law enforcement. The emotional toll was immense. Reliving the incident meant confronting not just one officer's actions, but a lifetime of moments where respect was conditional and safety uncertain. Yet there was also resolve. This case was bigger than one man. It was about setting a precedent that misconduct would not be excused simply because it wore a uniform. The trial reached its peak as closing arguments drew near. The courtroom was filled with tension, each side aware that the verdict would resonate beyond the individuals involved. Jurors had seen the footage, reviewed the documents, and listened to expert analysis. They had witnessed the gap between the officer's justification and the reality captured on camera. The central question was no longer whether a mistake had occurred, but whether that mistake was rooted in racial bias and abuse of authority. The narrative that a stolen vehicle justified extreme measures collapsed under scrutiny. What remained was an uncomfortable truth about how easily suspicion attaches itself to blackness, regardless of status. The defense struggled to reconcile the contradictions. Assertions of reasonable suspicion unraveled when compared to objective evidence. The officer's demeanor, once framed as caution, appeared aggressive and dismissive. Each attempt to rationalize the arrest highlighted systemic flaws rather than isolated misjudgment. The jury deliberated with the weight of history pressing on them. This was not just a case about one arrest. It was about accountability in a system where consequences for misconduct were rare. The judge, sitting quietly, understood the irony of his position. He had ruled on countless cases, yet now his faith rested in 12 strangers tasked with deciding whether justice would prevail. When the verdict was read, it carried clarity and consequence. The jury found in favor of the judge, recognizing that his rights had been violated and that racial profiling had played a decisive role. The award of $1.7 million was not merely compensation. It was a statement. The courtroom absorbed the moment in silence. For the officer in the city, it was a reckoning. For the judge, it was validation, not of personal worth, which he had never doubted, but of the truth he had insisted upon from the beginning. The ruling sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities. Training protocols were questioned. Policies were reviewed. Departments faced renewed pressure to address implicit bias and enforce accountability. Critics argued about the financial costs, but supporters emphasized the moral cost of inaction. For many watching, the verdict represented a rare instance where the system corrected itself. Yet it also underscored how exceptional such outcomes were. Justice, it seemed, still required extraordinary circumstances and relentless perseverance to be achieved. In the aftermath, the judge returned to the bench carrying a deeper understanding of the disparities he had long studied academically. His experience reshaped his perspective, reinforcing the responsibility he held to ensure fairness not just in rulings, but in acknowledging the lived realities of those before him. The city implemented reforms, though skeptics questioned their depth and longevity. Public discussions about racial profiling gained renewed urgency, fueled by a case that stripped away excuses and demanded reflection. For many Black Americans, the story confirmed what they already knew, that status does not equal safety. The financial award did not erase the trauma. It did not undo the fear felt during the arrest or the humiliation endured in public view, but it did provide a measure of accountability, a tangible acknowledgement that what happened was wrong. The judge used his platform to advocate for change, emphasizing that justice must be proactive, not reactive. He spoke about the importance of empathy and enforcement and the necessity of dismantling assumptions that place entire communities under suspicion. The case became a reference point in legal education, cited in discussions about civil rights and police accountability. It reminded future lawyers and judges that the law is only as just as those who enforce it. Most importantly, it offered a powerful lesson to viewers and listeners. Racism within systems does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, masked as routine procedure, justified by vague suspicions. Challenging it requires courage, resilience, and an unwavering commitment to truth. This story is not just about one arrest or one verdict. It is about the countless moments where dignity is tested and the choice to stand against injustice carries risk. It is a reminder that progress is neither automatic nor guaranteed, but possible when individuals refuse to accept silence as an answer. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you reflect, make sure you like, share, comment, and subscribe to Black Voice Stories. Your support helps bring these truths to light and ensures that voices demanding justice continue to be heard.